The next morning, I put my plan straight into action. This was simple enough. There was no listing for Traven in the local directories, and the number he'd left with the store didn't answer. But that didn't discourage me. He would have used a different name with the phone company, and you could hardly expect him to answer his phone, given his present condition. I had to hope, however, that the basic information he'd left with the store was genuine. If it was, I should be able to cross-reference the phone number and address and discover where he was living. When I arrived in Berlin around 10, my first stop was the post office. No one there remembered Traven's name, but a clerk penciled in RFD2, the rural delivery number he'd left with the store, onto my map. Following these directions, I stuck with the highway for 3 miles, then turned left into an unmarked secondary road. Running straight for a time, it eventually began climbing steeply, then twisted its way through a thick stand of spruce. The first mailbox, the next step in my plan, appeared shortly afterward. It was a square one at the end of a short drive leading to an aluminum universal home. The letters on the box were black and silver stick-ons, the sort farmers use on their pickups. I slowed to read them, pressing the microphone switch on the cassette recorder I'd picked up in Boston. I knew this couldn't be Traven, but you have to start somewhere, so W.F. Grafton became first on my list. Around the bend, in quick succession, there were 3 more places just like this. Then came a gap, a mile of cedar and spruce, and then a large New England-style house, all turrets and porches and dormers. Before each, I slowed slightly and murmured the owner's name into the mic. The miles rolled on. I learned that orange reflective letters are easier to read than black ones. I wondered about the etiquette of rural styles of address, the formality of H. Edward Wilmot, the terseness of Carson's, and I tried unsuccessfully to discern the patterns of land development here. A few suburban bungalows would be pressed tight together at the side of the road. Then you'd have 2 miles of wilderness, a patch of rural slum, a fine old farmhouse overlooking a valley, and then bungalows and TV antennas again. After a time, however, even these signs of relative civilization petered out, and the forest pressed in. Logging roads led into nowhere. A big sign in the shape of an Indian pointed down a lane to a kids' camp, then nothing. More trees, miles of them, until, with a hollow rumble, my wheels kicked up the logs on a bridge, and I flashed by a hunting camp. Then nothing again. By noon, I'd looped back to the main road, and finding Route 3 again, I turned toward Lancaster. In my motel room, I ate a Big Mac, then played back my tape, giving myself a list of all the people living in RFD2. Now, tediously, I looked up all their names in the phone book, hoping to match the number Traven had left with the photo store. In 25 minutes, I had it. Michael Traven had been staying at something called Gary's White Mountain Camp. This was the opposite of what I'd been hoping for. Hotel, lodge, campground, these were the sorts of places where he might have stayed for a couple of days before moving on. I tried to recall what it looked like, but all that I got was an image of bush, so I drove out there. Even knowing where it was, this took almost an hour, for it was at the wilderness end of my run. The road cut across a narrow notch in the hills, passed over a stream, then climbed steeply up a higher hill beyond. The mailbox, drooping on its post, was at the bottom of this upgrade, at the junction of a narrow dirt road that ran back into the bush. Drawing up beside it, I got out of the Ford and looked around, but memory had served me regrettably well. There was really nothing to look at but trees, no buildings. The nearest house was 5 or 8 minutes back, and there wasn't much further on till you curled down the far side of the hill toward the highway. I walked up to the gate. It was new and padlocked shut, but it was just a regular metal farm gate. The road to the camp itself, disappearing into the trees behind it, might have run on for miles. I drove back to Lancaster. By then it was after 3 in the afternoon. I called the camp number a couple of times, but there was no answer, and then before it got too late, I decided to check a point. Lancaster, though smaller than Berlin, is the seat of Cook County, New Hampshire. As such, it boasts a fine old courthouse, with as much varnished brightwork inside as a millionaire's yacht, which contains the local deed registry. A clerk gave me a hand with the books, and I traced out the history of Gary's camp. The original Gary had been one Gerard Ledoux, who'd put the land together in 1947. In 1962, it had passed by probate to his wife, who'd hung on to it for another 3 years. Since then, it had changed hands fairly regularly, about every 2 years, the last purchaser, a man named Evans, having bought it 10 months previously. I wasn't much disappointed by this. I hadn't really expected to find Traven listed as owner. Going back to the motel, I tried the camp number again, but still got no answer. No answer. That evening, again watching television, Lancaster had few other diversions to offer a stranger. I wondered about this. It did seem a bit funny. This was November. I hadn't hunted in a long time, and I never hunted in this state, but I guessed we were close to the deer season, hardly the time when a hunting camp would close down. Of course, everyone might be off in the bush, or the camp might have gone bankrupt, or conceivably Mr. Evans had purchased the land for different reasons altogether. Still, as I went on trying the number and getting no response, I decided I wasn't going to let up on the caution. The next morning, around 9, I drove into Berlin and paid a visit to the Pinkham Notch Shop, a sporting goods store on the main street. Here, a friendly, knowledgeable Canuck sold me a bush shirt, a heavy wool sweater, a camouflage poncho, a rubberized ground sheet, 2 canteens, 1 hatchet, a Russell belt knife, a flashlight, a Silva compass, Bushnell 10-power binoculars, and a nylon pack to put everything in. He had no maps, but I assumed I wouldn't have to go far. I went on to a grocery, ham, cheese, bread, a liter of cheap Valpolicella. Back in the car, I filled up the canteens with the wine, then drove out of town. The day was no better than yesterday, cold and drear, but inside the old Ford's comfortable fug, old, ancient dust, cigarette smoke, the cold world turned remote, like a movie or the miniaturized landscape toy trains pass through. The Androscoggin River was a twist of gray modeling clay. Toothpicks made birches that rattled their branches against the slate sky, and the thick stands of spruce were bits of pipe cleaner dipped into ink. Slowly, I climbed through the hills of RFD2. Out of habit, I kept one eye on the mailboxes and noted that a few red flags were up, signaling the mailman to stop for a letter. I recognized landmarks now, a twist in the road that revealed a long, forested valley, a hill topped with an enormous, gnarled spruce, and I even had my favorite sights, an old frame farmhouse with a white paddock and 3 Shetland ponies, and the burned-out shell of a barn beside the white splash of a stream. After a time, a pickup truck passed me, the first vehicle I'd seen on this road, and then getting closer, I slowed. Once again, loose logs bounced under my wheels as I crossed over a bridge, and 100 yards on, the road bent slightly left. As it straightened out, it passed the camp gate, still locked, and began climbing steeply again. At this point, I checked the odometer. 1 2/10 miles further on, a logging road ran off to the left. It was further than I would have liked, but there was really no other place to pull over, and the ground, though bumpy, was firm. I nosed the car in. 10 yards on, the track widened a little and pulled a bit right, then became so overgrown as to be completely impassable. But this was perfect for me. The jog meant the Ford wouldn't be seen from the highway. To keep dry, I went through the contortions of changing inside the car. The flannel bush shirt, an ugly green and black plaid, went over my regular shirt. Then came the hiking boots and the sweater, which was loose enough to be comfortable. Next, I packed up the knapsack, making sure the binoculars and ground sheet went in last, and slung it over my shoulder, paperboy style, so that it rested on my left hip. Finally, on top of everything else came the poncho. Drawing up its hood, I stepped into misery. Coniferous forest, especially if it's been cut ever recently, makes about the worst bush in the world. After 5 minutes, I knew this stuff was pure hell, a northern equivalent to the Amazon jungle. The trees, mainly spruce, grew so tightly together that you could barely move, and their thick, heavy boughs made it impossible to see where you were going. Dead branches jabbed like spikes. Underfoot, branches left from past cutting had turned slick as ice, and everything was wet. After 10 feet, my pant legs were soaked. There was nothing to do but grit my teeth and bowl forward, though I was backwards about 50% of the time. I blundered through huge, sticky cobwebs, branches slashed a dozen stinging cuts on my face, and the rain sifted down as an acrid, resinous haze. It was like taking a bath in Retsina. To make matters worse, I'd started high up on the slope and kept sliding downhill, though I was trying to make a straight course, a little east of north, that would keep me parallel to the camp road. After 10 minutes, though, I gave up on all that fancy stuff and just tried to make sure I didn't circle back on myself. Eventually, things got a little easier. I stumbled onto a deer path, running northwest downhill, but I was in no mood to be finicky, and for 10 minutes I enjoyed quick, easy going. Then the ground opened up, spruce and pine giving way to maple and oak, their leaves gleaming russet and gold in the gloom, and I was even able to glimpse the miserable sky overhead. I took a breather then and tried to fix my position. I'd been walking for 45 minutes, but probably hadn't traveled a mile from my entry point. I'd been well up the mountain to begin with, but had definitely been angling downhill, which meant, by my calculations, that I'd eventually intersect the camp road. But I didn't want to do this, or at least not too soon, or in an uncontrolled way. My idea was to reconnoiter the camp, making absolutely certain that I saw the occupants, if any, long before they spotted me. I looked around. I was standing in a clearing full of small oaks, but there was one tall larch nearby, and I decided to climb it. Not easy. There were no low branches, so I had to cut notches with my hatchet and shinny the first 10 feet, and by the time I reached the first big branch, my fingers were glued together with resin and bark. But I got what I wanted, a view, and at 20 feet I hung on and peered out. Across the valley there was nothing to see, just a long gray sweep of trees. But looking backwards, up the hill I'd been coming down, I saw just what I wanted, a rocky outcrop near the summit. I took a compass bearing on it, clambered down, and allowed myself 2 gulps of wine before starting out. It was 12:20 when I left for the knoll. I reached it exactly 2 hours later. By then, I'd begun to get the hang of these woods. For reasons of soil or climate, the evergreens, like some drab forest infantry, commanded the heights while the hardwoods marched in their bright dress uniforms along the lower slopes. And on the lower ground, on the hillside flattened out into the valley, the trees were much older, or at least larger, and grew further apart. Since all of this made the going much easier, that's where I stayed, keeping parallel to the hill, which of course I'd eventually have to climb. But here I could walk rather than scramble, find my way rather than blunder on blindly. My steps and my breathing fell into a rhythm, while my mind found a nice quiet spot at the back of my skull and happily dozed. Still, this comfort was only relative. I was still cold and very wet. The rain came down hard for 10 minutes, and these open woods gave me a little protection. But I made steady progress, and when the rain slacked off, I even caught a whiff of that lovely forest fragrance, damp earth, fresh water, pine needles, the soft rot under logs. After I rested a while on a rock, my breath finally stilled, and I listened quietly to the soft forest drip all around me. Memories came back. Pennsylvania, hunting trips with my father, the perfect silence that forms just before your finger squeezes the trigger, the ache you always get at the back of your legs. 5 minutes later, coming into the open, I was able to look up the hillside and see my knoll almost directly above. From now, it was all uphill, and it was a high hill, but this was easier than I expected. The ground was much rockier, the footing easier, and though the hardwoods petered out, this stonier soil supported fewer trees altogether, some spruce and pine, but more birch and cedar. Up the steepest slopes, I had to crawl on all fours, but most of the time I could find a spot to wedge my foot in, and frequently small runs of boulders formed traverses that let me work my way up at an angle. Even better, about halfway up I hit a rocky ledge, a sort of shelf that made an easy path. I worked along this quite comfortably, now and then catching glimpses, huge sweeps of space of the valley below me, and then the path opened up. A big blast of wind hit me, and I stepped onto the knoll. But it really wasn't a knoll. As I rested a moment, leaning back on a rock, I realized it was a flat ledge, an expansion of the ledge I'd been walking along, that projected from the hillside like a fungus jutting out from a tree. It was completely open, the wind blustered in my ears, and up this high even the dark, overcast sky was dazzling. Shading my eyes, I stared over the valley. A dizzying expanse of space opened out, a curve of high gray sky above, a curve of dark khaki below. I guessed that the valley was about 2 miles wide, though I've never been a great judge of distances. The opposite hill was a little lower than the one I was on, but higher hills rose beyond it. Though the floor of the valley was rough and wooded, I also caught a glint of water through the trees, a substantial stream, if not quite a river. On the far side of this, a little way up the hill, Gary's camp was clearly visible, one large building, 2 smaller ones, a trickle of smoke. Reassured that it was there, I turned away for a moment. In behind a big boulder, I stretched out my ground sheet, holding down the corners with stones, and set out a rather soggy picnic. But I was starving. Even my pasty sandwiches tasted terrific, and I refused to complain about the plastic aftertaste the canteen lent the wine. Finally stretching my legs out, I relaxed with a cigarette. I even thought of a fire, but then decided against it. I could build one all right. I could sense various old skills coming back. But in this rain it was bound to smoke, and if I could see smoke from Gary's, presumably they would see mine. Taking no chance, I let a second cigarette warm me instead. By 3 o'clock I was ready to get down to business. At the extreme edge of the knoll, a couple of boulders made a kind of chair, and I wedged myself in and examined the valley with my binoculars. I could see the road I'd driven up, but the camp road, the one with the gate, wasn't visible at all. Indeed, the most conspicuous feature of this landscape was the stream, a snaking gleam through the trees. At one point the bank opened into a meadow, presumably a spot where it flooded in the spring, and just beneath the camp itself the bank was very rocky, a scree of small boulders about 20 yards wide. On the far side of the stream, this rocky beach ended at the base of a hill, almost a cliff, which sheered up to a wide, flat terrace that was quite open except for a few cedar trees. It was here that the camp had been built. There were 3 separate buildings. The largest, its front facing me directly, was the type of New England farmhouse I was learning to admire. It was built on 2 levels, 2 full stories, and an attic with dormers. At the eastern end rose a high, hexagonal tower and a roofed veranda wrapped around the ground floor. The roof of the house was shingled with cedar shakes, very weathered. Judging by them and the sag in the roof of the veranda, I guessed that the place had been allowed to run down, though somebody was clearly taking care of it now. Even in this dull light, it gleamed with fresh paint, white for the walls, dark green for the shutters and trim. Parallel to this main building, no doubt the lodge, stood a smaller one, about the same vintage, a kind of coach house, and off to the right, and closer to me, there was a long shed with a metal roof. Amidst all this real estate, I detected a few signs of humanity. Smoke still trickled from the chimney, a white wisp against the gray sky, and just as I lifted the binoculars, I was fairly certain that I'd heard the faint, faraway whap of a door slamming shut. A back door perhaps, for no one appeared at the front. In addition, 3 vehicles were parked on a patch of gravel in front of the metal-roofed shed. A small brown pickup truck, a yellow Volkswagen Scirocco, and a rusted sedan whose boxy shape took a moment to recognize, an ancient Datsun 510. So I thought, someone was home. Why didn't they answer their phone? But as I stared down at the place, keeping those flat, hard binocular images steady in front of my eyes, I wondered if there wasn't a more relevant question. What had Traven's status been here? If this was really a hunting camp, had he been a guest, an employee? Thinking this over, I crouched in my eyrie and tried to keep warm with my wine and my cigarettes. Half an hour slipped by. I kept telling myself that this wasn't too bad. Indeed, the rain stopped completely, and after a while the wind switched around, putting me comfortably in the lee of the hill. I watched a hawk drift over the valley and studied a doe taking a drink from the stream, each sip paid for with a frightened, quivering look. 10 more minutes, 1 more cigarette, and then, without warning, a figure stepped off the veranda. I grabbed up the binoculars, pushed hair out of my eyes, thumbed the focusing wheel. The figure was a man, walking briskly across to the cars. I only had him perfectly clear for a second, just as he stepped into the pickup. Blue jeans, windbreaker, unzipped, a hint of reddish-brown hair. A glimpse, that's all it was, but in a way that made him almost easier to identify. Surprise? Elation? Fear? A little of each. As the truck backed around and turned into the trees, I set down the glasses and let go of my breath. A short, red-haired, weasel-faced man. The man in Halifax, behind Granger's place. The man who'd floated in the darkness beyond Brightman's study, then disappeared down the hall like a ghost.